From the campus of the Ignite Institute at the Roebling Innovation Center in Erlanger, Kentucky, Ignite Student Media presents the first annual Ignite Institute Political Forum.
Hello, my name is Samantha Lunn, and I am the Social Studies teacher for the Biomedical Sciences College here at Ignite. Today, we would like to welcome two candidates for state representative in Kentucky's 66th district. Incumbent Representative Massey and his challenger, Mr. Roberto Henriquez. You have both been longtime supporters of public education in our state, and we are so grateful to have you here today. Our ninth grade government scholars have prepared a series of questions for you based on the issues that they find most pertinent to Kentucky. Before we get started, I would like to give each of you a chance to briefly introduce yourselves.
Well, good morning. My name is Ed Massey, and it's an honor to be here. Many of you may have heard my name because I was on the Boone County School Board for 22 years. And in fact, I was part of helping build this awesome school that you're in here today. So I really appreciate the opportunity to come and be with you. 2 years ago, I left the school board to take the seat in Frankfort. I represent the Boone County District 66 position in the House. There's 100 members in the House. And I serve on multiple committees. I serve on the Education Committee. I'm Vice Chair of Judiciary. I serve on Veterans, Military Affairs, and Public Protection. I serve on Licensing and Occupations with Representative Koenig, who's the chair, I think spoke earlier. And I also serve on the Budget Subcommittee for Post-Secondary Education. In addition, I'm chairing a work group on judicial reform, and I'm on the Governor's Task Force for Judicial Reform. And finally, we're working on a group informally around the pension to try to protect our teachers, to make sure that we can retain our teachers that we have and recruit good teachers in the future. It's an opportunity that I've enjoyed immensely, and I look forward to hopefully serving you again in the District 66 in Frankfort, which begins in January. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Roberto Enricez, and I'm running for state representative in District 66 in Boone County. I grew up in Boone County and went to Boone County High School, and my kids attend Boone County schools. I'm very excited to be running in this race, and I'm very happy to be here today. I want to thank everybody for inviting Mr. Massey and myself here for this meeting and for this conversation.
Hi, my name is Cassie Morrow, and this question is for Representative Massey. Mr. Henriquez's website states that he believes in spending tax dollars on public schools instead of private and charter schools. Representative Massey, you have been a longtime supporter of public education, and I would like to learn more about your feelings on spending tax dollars on schools. With circumstances from COVID-19, now is an important time to make sure everyone stays safe as they return to in-person instruction. This is difficult since public schools have many students and little space. How do you feel that tax dollars should be spent on schools in a way that it is fair for all schools to get the resources and regulation that they deserve and need? And how do you think that the issue of crowded classrooms can be remedied in a timely manner to make sure that students and teachers stay safe during the pandemic?
Thank you for that very intuitive question. Anybody that knows me knows my passion for education. I also am an attorney, and so I always tell people that law is my occupation, but education is my passion. I've been in education for nearly 30 years. I was a substitute teacher when I was in law school. When I graduated from law school, I got elected to the board, and then subsequently became the Kentucky School Board Association president and the National School Board Association president. And during that time, I've always said that schools have been underfunded. Specifically in Kentucky in 1990 with the CARE Act, there was a lot of discussion about schools because Kentucky at that time was not doing well. We were near the bottom of the ranks. And CARE Act came along, the Kentucky Education Reform Act, and there were a lot of changes made. During that time, there was actually talk about getting rid of boards of education, but they did not do that. They elected not only to have boards, but to have site-based councils. And site-based councils, as you may be aware, are councils that involve parents in the community, because I believe that parent engagement is a huge component of a school's success. So that all being said, I'm very clear about my statement that I am not for directing money away from what I believe are already underfunded public schools and transferring that money to private or charter schools. My worry is that it would create a greater chasm between the rich and the poor. In fact, some children whose parents can afford it would be able to take that tax credit, if you will, that money, and match that money and put their child in a private school. But a poor family wouldn't have that same opportunity. And so what would happen is you would create a greater gap between the folks that could afford it and the folks that could not. Under Kentucky law, we are to provide a free and appropriate public education to every student. Every student. That means students with special needs. That means students that have great successes. You know, I've always said one of the things that we failed students on when I was in Boone County is that some of our advanced students, we weren't able to give them the opportunities that they needed to not be held to the middle component. In other words, they should be able to explore their skills and their talents. As we've moved towards basically individual learning segments, people can do that now. They can move towards their particular skills. And you know, certainly in Boone County, we believe that every child should be college and career ready when they graduate from Boone County. And I think that's kind of one of the mottos that I was involved in creating. So yes, I believe that money should be infused into our schools. I believe teachers have not been paid what they should be paid. Most teachers, I will tell you, have as much education as any doctor, lawyer, or engineer, and yet they're paid at a very low rate, in my opinion. Now, some people say, well, that's because they have summers off. But I can tell you from having served in the classroom, it was one of the most fun yet challenging jobs that I ever had. I had to come home and take a nap, and that was when I was in my 20s, not now. But I believed in that because we're educating our future. So we talk about leadership in our country, and we talk about what's important. But if we don't take care of our future leaders by properly giving them the education they deserve, then we're going to have a challenge, even more challenges in the future. And I'm worried because all three of my daughters are involved in education. In fact, my oldest daughter, who graduated from Connor, is a teacher in Kenton County, teaches third grade at Whites Tower Elementary. My middle daughter is the director of finance for the Tennessee School Boards Association. And my youngest daughter, Breonna, will graduate in December and will be looking for a job, and she wants to work in Boone County. So all of them are educators and teachers, and yet I'm concerned because I don't feel that teacher salaries have kept up with the pace. That being said, if the legislature affects their pensions in a negative way, the concern there is teachers were always under the idea, well, I don't get paid great, but I got a good pension. And if we start taking those pensions away, then the worry is, how do we recruit people, good quality teachers to be in the classroom? Because it's been found that the true success of a student is based on a good quality teacher in the classroom. So yes, I think it's, you might have seen an ad that came out this week by the proponents of tax credits. They put a picture of Donald Trump next to me and said, "You're fired," because I didn't support moving that money from our public schools over to our private schools. Now, I'm not against private schools, but private schools are just that. They're private. And if you elect to send your child to private school, that's great, fantastic. If you want to have a charter school and send your child to a charter school, that's fantastic. But I would never move for moving money from schools until we are fully funded. The last thing I'll say, and I'll give it to my opponent, is that when they passed the law with regards to this, they said the legislature had not been properly funding public education. So there's a constitutional mandate from Kentucky that basically we will fully fund public education. When the Rose decision came out, there's another important component of that people often forget. And it says that obligation to fully fund public education shall not be shifted to the local counties or the local boards of education. And so what's had to happen in the past is we've had in Boone County had to take advantage of the 4% tax increase that we did that a number of times, because if we had not done that, we were getting such an amount of decreasing funds from the state that we could not provide the opportunities that we have here for the students. So I will continue to battle for education. That's a passion of mine. My three passions are basically education, the law, and Veterans Affairs. And so that's my committees that I serve on in Frankfort, and I look forward to continuing that work. Thank you.
This is one of the areas where Mr. Massey and I are in a considerable amount of agreement. Education is very, very important. I taught public school myself for a little over 5 years. My mother was a public school teacher, retired from education. And education is extremely important. It's actually one of the few spelled out constitutional responsibilities of the state legislature is providing for the public education. So therefore, I think it should be the first thing that our legislature addresses, should be funding our public schools. Historically, like Mr. Massey pointed out, our schools have been terribly underfunded. Kara attempted to address some of those funding inequities between the school systems in the state, and it definitely made some improvements, but as with most things, I think there are improvements that can continue to be made. One of the things on leadership is, where are we going to find additional funding for schools? And I think that's one of the issues that our legislature has skirted around, saying that we need to allocate what money we have and we can't raise more money. In order to fund our public schools, we need to identify additional sources of revenue. And it's not going to be a silver bullet where it's just one source for that. Whether it's expanded gaming, whether it's expanding some of the tax breaks for people with large ticket items. We need to identify additional sources of revenue so that we can fully fund schools. I commit to that being my number one priority. Education is fully funded. Mandates from the state are funded. If there's going to be a mandate from the legislature on what public schools have to do, it should come with the money to execute those mandates. I'm definitely against providing public funds for private schools and for charter schools. As Mr. Massey said, if they're private, they're private. And if you can afford to send your student to a private, that's great, but the public funds need to go to the public schools.
Thank you.
This is not in anything in opposition to my opponent, Mr. Enriquez, but I will say one of the things that I had the privilege to do, and I didn't mention it in my opening, is House Bill 444 in 2019. But for 444, this school would not have opened. Part of the reason is because Boone County and Kenton County came together. The state would not allow the money to flow from Kenton County to Boone County because the school sits on Boone County property. So we had at the last hour to pass this House Bill 444, which allowed that money to flow, which allowed this school to be open. I just wanted to point that out because I'm very honored to be in this institution and glad we did get it open.
Hello, I'm Whitley Clifton. This question is for Mr. Henriquez. Mr. Henriquez, in response to school shootings, Representative Massey agreed to pass a bill concluding all schools should have an armed resource officer on campus. This act included a mental health provision requiring a counselor for every 250 students. This Kentucky Senate Bill 8 was entitled an act.
Okay. Sorry. That's our fault. You just come up here.
I can't hear the question. Sorry.
Closer.
Mr. Henriquez, in response to school shootings, Representative Massey agreed to pass a bill including all schools should have an armed resource officer on campus. This act included a mental health provision requiring a counselor for every 250 students. This Kentucky Senate Bill 8 was entitled an act relating to school safety and declaring an emergency. Do you believe being armed is the best way to protect ourselves? And in your opinion, is this the only option to protect our schools? Would you have agreed with this bill? And if not, what action do you believe schools should have taken in order to be prepared?
Thanks for the question. I appreciate that. There are, as with many things, there's not a silver bullet. There's not one answer. So, directly to the question, I don't believe that's the only way to protect ourselves. and protect our schools. Historically, our schools have had a lack of mental health professionals and counselors, and I strongly support movement to fund additional counselors and additional mental health services for our public schools. I think it's very, very important that we have those resources available and that they can build those relationships with the students and understand what the issues are and what the students' concerns are so that we can get that early intervention. Having an armed guard in the school, I think is a reaction, as reactive rather than proactive. I like the providing mental health services and additional resources for the students and the schools, because that's more of a proactive approach. Let's try to take care of the issue before there becomes an issue. Having a resource officer in a school, I think, is a positive thing. I think it allows the students to build a relationship with police officers and police officer to build a relationship with the students. And I think that can be very valuable as well.
Thank you. And I'm happy to report that Senate Bill 1 of last year was also, because of the shooting that happened in Marshall County, was a funding mechanism to fund school safety and to fund those counselors. You may not be aware of this, another piece of history. Boone County is not the first, was one of the first districts in Kentucky to have school resource officers. I was actually a brand new board member, a baby board member, I think it was in 1998, when this was brought to us by the Sheriff's Department. One of the current board members, Ms. Bird, who's still on the Board of Education, and I were the only two remaining board members from that time. But initially our reaction was, we do not want to have any guns in schools. And the Sheriff's Department changed my mind. Here's why they changed my mind. They said, we want to be in the schools to protect your students. If you're not going to give us one of the fundamental tools of our job, then we don't want to be in your schools. If we can't protect ourselves, then we can't protect the students. And they changed my mind. And so then we got school resource officers in several of our schools. It wasn't until the Marshall County shooting that we expanded it to have a resource officer in every school. Previously, it had been on campuses. And so therefore, the response time had been reduced. Now, that being said, I am a firm believer in our school resource officers. That was a grant initially, then Boone County Board agreed to fund it, and then when the Marshall County shooting occurred, the Sheriff's Department and the county and the board came together to ensure that we would have a school resource officer in every school in Boone County to protect our students. And I think that has been a wonderful thing. Frankly, about 4 years ago, I fought a big battle in Boone County when a group came in and they wanted us to be able to allow teachers that had concealed and carry permits to carry their firearms into the classroom. And we researched that project. We didn't just initially say no, we researched it. We heard from insurance companies, we heard from mental health providers, we heard from school providers, and the idea was we don't want any weapons in school unless it is by somebody that is trained and regularly trained in their occupation as a school resource officer to protect the students. I believe there's a lot of things we can do to protect our schools. Mental health is a component. I agree with mental health. I've agreed with it my entire time serving on the Board of Education. And so I believe that that is a component. If a student feels threatened or feels in need, then they need to be able to have somebody to go talk to. I'm friends with a number of people that are victims. There's a lady from Paducah Tillman. There was a school shooting there. She was a student named Missy Jenkins Smith. She was shot. She was in a prayer group in a circle. And a young man carried a bunch of long guns in a blanket into the school and opened fire into the circle, killing several students. She was paralyzed. She now speaks across the nation. We had her address that issue about school resource officers. And she would tell you, I'm for school resource officers, but I am not for having other guns in school. She's also for mental health. In fact, she's a counselor now down in an adjoining school district. And when the Marshall County shootings happened, she actually went in and was a counselor to some of those students. I also worked with a lady named Erin Gruelle, the Freedom Rider teacher. And Erin obviously teaches very difficult children. Her story is based out of Los Angeles, which is one of the most difficult areas in the nation. And yet she tried to speak against violence in the schools. And so yes, my whole career, I have tried to protect the safety of the students and the teachers. You know, when my daughters became teachers, they did not become teachers to be armed security guards. They became teachers to be teachers. But we want to protect our teachers. We want to harden up our schools, which means have more secure areas. That's where you see all the badges now. You have to sign in, the doors are locked, et cetera. We try to harden the target. And then we try to work on the social emotional learning piece, which allows students to be more comfortable in their environment. We try to put an end to bullying and create zero tolerance policies regarding that. So it's a very important question. It's obviously a priority in the legislature because it was Senate Bill 1. And if you know any history, it's not so much that way in the House, but in the Senate, they number their bills by order of priority. So that being Senate Bill 1 was saying that we are going to do something in Kentucky to protect our schools. The House joined in with that, and I'm continuing to work with that group as we try to fund that.
Thank you.
So if I could have a response. So my mom taught at Ryle High School, and she was there when Ryle High School opened. The shooting that happened at Ryle High School in Boone County, Clay Shrout shooting, took place there, and the student, in case you aren't familiar with it, the student had murdered his family in the morning and went to school, was trying to get to his fourth period teacher and decided that he wouldn't be able to get to it, so he took his second period class hostage. And what resolved that situation was the assistant principal, Steve Sorrell, not the school resource officer, not an armed teacher, not an armed person. It was the assistant principal who had the relationship with the student and talked him out of hurting his classmates and into releasing his weapon. So I think the social emotional should be the first priority and the first thing we look at, and the weapon being, an armed conflict being secondary to that.
Just very briefly, just so you know, 1994, I believe, is when the Clay Shrout shooting happened. We did not have SROs in Boone County at that time. They had not come into play. As I told you before, it was like 1998 before it was introduced into Boone County. I agree that we should teach our principals, our administrators, and our teachers how to deal with the conflicts and try to resolve them if possible. But in the event that doesn't or cannot happen, then we need to have somebody on site, because the average police officer response time from somewhere in the county is going to be anywhere from 3 to 5 to 10 minutes. And sometimes 3 to 5 to 10 minutes is too late and students' lives are lost. That's exactly what happened in Columbine. So we have to take that into mind, but just know that we did not have school resource officers at that time.
Okay, we'll move on to the next question now.
Hello, Representative Massey. There have been many things going on with the Breonna Taylor case, and many citizens have disapproved of the proceedings. 2 of the involved officers were not charged, and the 3rd was indicted due to wanton endangerment for firing into a neighboring apartment. With these rulings being released to the public after the trial, protests have sparked all over Louisville and many other Kentucky cities. My question to you is, do you think this case was correctly prosecuted, and in what ways should the local and federal government be responding to the protesters who feel that justice was not served?
Thank you. This is a question that's right up my alley as a practicing attorney. First and foremost, I will tell you that when the Breonna Taylor matter happened, I wasn't even aware of it initially. Then I received approximately 1,000 calls to my private law practice demanding justice for Breonna. And the more I queried those people, the more I learned that they really didn't understand how those matters work. So let me go over that quickly. First of all, it was a so-called no-knock warrant. But to get a no-knock warrant, you don't just have one of those, you have to get an affidavit that is prepared explaining all the reasons you should be able to go to that home, to knock or enter the home, if there's a no-knock warrant, to not knock, and to enter the home in order to try to quell criminal activity. That has to be signed by a judge. And at least in our area, there's been no question about the judge, about why even sign that warrant. So that's the first thing. The second thing is when they got to the scene and they knocked on the door, they said they knocked on the door, and there's some debate about whether they did knock or didn't announce themselves, and that's in the grand jury testimony that's coming out in the public. But notwithstanding, when they went into the home, they were fired upon. And I can tell you that officers are trained to return deadly force if deadly force is entered onto them. At that juncture, there was no indication at all that, to my knowledge, that there was some kind of intent to do harm to anyone. It was a responsive measure. Now, thinking about the three officers, first of all, the officer that emptied his firearm into the house was not the officer that was indicted for wanton endangerment. Wanton endangerment is when you have reckless disregard that can cause serious injury or death to somebody else. The officer that discharged his weapon where the bullet went into an adjoining house where there were family members in that house, that's the reason for the 3 counts of wanton endangerment. I really don't see how a grand jury in this case could have done anything else. Now, it's important for the community to have a debate about these warrants. I can tell you that having practiced law for 29 years, part of the reason there is no-knock warrants is because due to the drug activity in our communities today, especially urban communities, there's concern for the officer's safety and the occupant's safety. So the idea is if you announce yourself, you're giving the occupants an opportunity to properly step up and defend themselves or to prepare to shoot into you when they come into the house. They also, it's been known in drug cases, and this was a strike force case, I believe, that they try to flush or get rid of all of the drugs so that the evidence can't be accumulated to use against them. So there needs to be a debate about this because I think we can all agree that drugs are a very harmful thing in our communities, whether it's prescription opiates or whether it's marijuana or cocaine or heroin. The fact of the matter is I'm not defending the officers at all. Officers are trained. They have training and it's ongoing training. I do support the police. And because a police officer or 2 or 3 may misbehave or act inappropriately at a given time doesn't mean that they all do. And so therefore, I do believe that the response was proper. I was very distraught and upset about all the riots and the looting. To me, a civil discussion to sit down and talk about these issues and try to resolve them is the way to go. And I understand that people are still crying out for justice for Breonna. It's tragic that she died. But I think the grand jury, I was actually surprised the way it came out, but I think it's the only answer the grand jury could have had. Thank you.
Mr. Enriquez, we'll give you 2 minutes to respond to the question as well.
Thank you. There's a number of issues going on here. I think, typically grand jury testimony and grand jury proceedings are not available to the public and are not known. I think a lot of people are making assumptions as to what may or may not have happened in the grand jury, what information was available. Well, I have never served on a grand jury. I have served on a trial jury. And I know that there is control as to what information is given to the jury and what they're instructed to consider and not consider. So we don't know what information was given to the jury, what information was not given to the jury. So I think it's very hard for us to say, yeah, they had all the information they needed, or no, they didn't have all the information they needed. But that being said, I think it goes to a larger issue with our, not only our police force, but our society in general. And I think, I'm sure you've heard the term systemic racism. And I believe that we do have systemic racism, that there are issues that happen. I've experienced it myself. I've been traveling and I've I was traveling by train once and had an entire train held up because they were looking through the manifest with somebody whose last name was Enriquez. And because I don't look stereotypically Latino, the Border Patrol agents actually walked by me twice, made a comment about my daughter, who was a baby at the time, and how cute she was. And it wasn't until we got back to our seats that they came and asked who I was, and they had a list of the manifest. And then once I said, yeah, my name's Roberto Enriquez, they proceeded to question me. So I think it's very tough to understand what people go through when there's this automatic assumption that there may be an issue with you because of your race, because of your heritage, because of your ethnicity. And I think there's a lot of frustration around that. Rioting is not okay. It's not okay to burn things, destroy property, kill other people. It's not okay. However, our Constitution does secure the right to protest and to take your grievances to the government and to your elected officials. And I wholeheartedly support that, and I participate in that regularly. I've protested for a number of things, and I think that's an important part of our process. So it's hard to know, did Breonna get justice? I have to say there are some very troubling things that I've heard come out of the reporting, but without knowing what happened in the grand jury, it's hard to say yes, no. For police, I support the good police, which are most of them. Most police officers are excellent people. They put their lives on the line and are there to protect us and serve us. However, there are some that don't do that, just like in any profession. You have good people and you have people that maybe aren't doing it for the right reason. And so I support the cops that want to make the police force better and want to help root out those few who are giving the rest of them a bad name.
Mr. Massey, if you would like 30 seconds to respond.
I think largely we're probably in agreement on this. I will tell you, I'm also on the board of directors for the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center. So one of the things we've talked about for a long time is what's called implicit bias. And if you've never taken one of those tests, you should go on the computer and Google it and take a test. Sometimes we have biases that we're not even aware of. And it's either that we've learned them in our culture, in our community, through our parents, whatever the case may be. The fact is we were all created equal, and we all need to have the same rights, and we need to have responsibilities. And if we violate those civil codes in the culture, then we have to be held accountable.
Mr. Enriquez, would you also like to respond?
Helps if I unmute myself. I was just saying, we all should be held responsible for our actions, and that's part of leadership, right? Is taking the lead and then taking your responsibility for those actions and for your decisions, both good and bad.
Okay, we'll move on to the next question.
Hi, Mr. Henriquez. I would like to continue the conversation from the last question to talk more about police reform. Right now in Kentucky and all over the country, there has been a lot of unrest over police killings that people view as unjust. One specific form of training, the no-knock warrant, will likely be removed from state law unless it is absolutely necessary in a situation. Some also think that there should be laws against police force in a situation unless someone's life is clearly in danger. What police reform actions do you believe would benefit the state of Kentucky for citizens as well as the police? What other types of police reform do you think should take place, if any?
Thank you for your question. Excellent follow-on to our discussion from the last one. So I think I definitely oppose no-knock warrants, as they're called. I understand some of the concerns about it, but when you surprise somebody, especially if they're asleep, it can sometimes be very confusing in the moment, and I think it creates a potentially dangerous situation that may not otherwise exist. So I oppose no-knock warrants, and I support the effort to remove those, to ban those. I think we need to see police reform into that, kind of like I talked about with schools and more mental health services. I think we need to see that same shift when it comes to the community and to the police, where we ask the police to deal with this tremendous variety of situations. Some are very well within their training and what they should be expected to do, and other things are way outside on the fringe of their training, and just honestly, they don't have the time to be an expert in everything. It's something very similar that we do to teachers in education. We keep expanding what we expect them to be responsible for and to take care of, rather than saying, you know what, let's identify the professionals that are good at that, and let's have them involved. So I think we need to see more mental health professionals working with the police in situations, more social service professionals to get people connected to the right social services that they may need. If somebody's homeless, rather than asking the police officer to determine, well, why are they homeless? What are they doing? Let's get them involved with services that can actually provide help for those people and those individuals. The term defund the police I find very, very distressing. I think it's whatever is meant by it when somebody says, it doesn't matter whether it's positive or not, it automatically puts people on the defensive and it sounds terrible. So I have a real problem with that term, defund the police. What I think we need to see is police reform and a transition to more community-involved policing. And let's let the police do what they're good at, fighting crime, identifying crimes and arresting people. That's what the police are good at, and that's what they should be provided for. And we need to provide services outside of that to address these other issues instead of just keeping it on the police force.
Mr. Massey, you'll have 2 minutes to respond.
I didn't mention this early on, but my undergraduate degree is police administration from Eastern Kentucky University. Every Saturday, I have breakfast with several retired law enforcement officers, many of them that served here in the local community. I think the concern of the police force is, like teachers, they're not paid a great deal of money. In fact, if you are familiar with any state troopers, many of them are paid so low that they have to do either secondary jobs or occupations in order to be able to support their families. So that's a problem. And so a lot of people are leaving the state police. In fact, several of them have left state police to come to Boone County because they pay better than the state police. So I think that one of the things that we have to deal with on the police side is that we need to make sure that we can take care of those good officers, get them the training that they need, and that we can find ways to properly take care of them because they are an element of our community. Now, the other problem in our society, whether you like it or not, is that people can be very well armed in our community. And so they're always on alert. When I talked to the sheriff 2 years ago about the constitutional carry bill, I thought they would object to that and say, well, no, we don't want to have everyone to be concealed because that would threaten us. When I called the sheriff, they're like, oh no, we're fine with it. And I asked him why, and he said, or I asked the assistant of the sheriff why, and he said, because we're trained to treat everyone as though they may have a weapon. So we have some problems in our society with this going back and forth, and I don't disagree with any of that, but I think defunding is not the answer. I'm all for mental health services. I'm all for community policing, which basically means that the officers are engaging the community and trying to get their buy-in into civility so we don't have unrest. That's why we have SROs. So for that reason, I believe that we need to continue working towards resolving these problems and support those that are taking care of us.
Gentlemen, thank you both for your responses. For the sake of time, we will move on to the next topic.
This question is for Representative Massey. According to the Kentucky General Assembly, you've helped sponsor House bills regarding health care. A recent example in response to COVID in House Bill 129, titled An Act Relating to Public Health, Making an Appropriation Therefore, and Declaring an Emergency, with the stated purpose to establish the amount of funds to be allocated and used by the local health departments in Kentucky for employment services and programs. Furthermore, in one of your speeches on health care for all residents, you stated that providing the highest quality health care with compassionate and accessible service for all community members is important. In the face of this global pandemic, what do you think is the proper way of handling healthcare quality and accessibility?
Thank you very much. I think that just before us, you heard from Representative Kim Mosier. She's the chair of the Health and Welfare Services Committee. The bill that you referenced, I supported that bill. I do believe that health care is an essential thing for all people. The pandemic has really opened our eyes to a lot of things we never experienced before. One of my frustrations serving in the legislature was when the pandemic started. The Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate went to the governor and tried to get him to stop the session and say, look, for the safety of everybody involved, we need to go home and we can call a special session and come back. The governor wasn't willing to do that, even though he was shutting down other things. I think we've come to realize through this pandemic that there are real threats out there, real health threats that we have to worry about. We're trying to figure out how to open schools and keep you safe and keep the teachers safe. In my office, we are wearing masks in the office. When we meet with clients, we wear masks. When we go to court, we have to wear masks. It's a different world. And I think more than ever, the importance of healthcare has been highlighted. And I think a lot like education, we've got to invest in healthcare. There's a lot of challenges on those horizons about that. It is a very expensive endeavor. I know there's some concerns about people being sued with respect to healthcare, or with regards to medical malpractice, et cetera. All of those issues are relevant issues that we need to have ongoing discussions about. I would invite you, when it opens up, to come down to the Health and Welfare Committee and sit in on the committee and offer some suggestions. We really want to hear from our community. I mean, what we're going through now is nothing that we've ever experienced before. I want us to all work together. The governor, the legislature, the courts. I want us to all work together so that we can get through this pandemic.
Thank you, Mr. Massey. Mr. Henriquez, if you'd like to answer that question as well.
Yes, thank you. So healthcare, I agree. I think everybody should have access to basic healthcare. I think it should be available to everybody in the state. There are a number of barriers to that we currently have. One of those is simply the geography of our state. Kentucky goes from what we're used to here in northern Kentucky, which is fairly suburban with some urban areas like, in Lexington and Louisville, to eastern Kentucky and western Kentucky, which are very rural and very mountainous, and it can be very difficult to even get medical care to those parts of the country, those parts of the state, and people have to travel a long way. So one of the things I think we need to do is we need to attract more healthcare providers to the state and make it more attractive for them to practice here in Kentucky. I think that's, expanding the responsibilities of physician assistants and nurse practitioners and allowing them to provide additional medical services. I think that's important. I think it's also important to encourage more competition. Here specifically in northern Kentucky, it's very difficult to get healthcare competition. St. Elizabeth Healthcare pretty much has Boone and Campbell County locked up when it comes to healthcare. Christ Hospital has tried to make some inroads, and they have opened some clinics, some offices, which is helpful, but I think healthcare competition in northern Kentucky and throughout Kentucky makes for better healthcare services. The pandemic has shown that healthcare is critical. Kentucky has an expanded amount of comorbidities, issues that make COVID even worse. So if everybody had access to more and better health care, it would help those underlying factors. And I think we'd see a lot better outcomes, not only with COVID, but in general in Kentucky.
Thank you.
Gentlemen, again, thank you both for your responses. We'll move on to the next question.
This question is for Mr. Henriquez. With climate change increasing over the past few years, it has been more and more important to use renewable energy. As of 2017, without the use of hydroelectricity, Kentucky was ranked 50th place in use of renewable energy. If you include hydroelectricity, we were ranked 36th. A lack of climate change awareness is one of the leading causes as to why the use of renewable energy in Kentucky is so low. How would you help educate people on the issue of climate change and increase the use of renewable energy in Kentucky?
Thank you. Kentucky for many, many years has been at the forefront of energy production in this country. And whether it's obviously mainly coal for many years, 100 years, some hydroelectric as well. It's time for Kentucky to start moving towards those new energies and being a part of the energy future, not just the energy past. In order to develop new energies, green energies, it requires an investment from the government. When electricity first started getting expanded throughout the country, there were a number of government programs that helped fund it and expand it until it was readily available and then became more privatized. Tennessee Valley Authority had a number of projects. So Kentucky, and on a federal level as well, but specifically Kentucky, we need to fund for that future of energy and do the research and provide retraining for those who are in industries that are becoming less viable, like coal. We're moving away from coal. We need to move away from coal. And rather than just trying to go back, we need to make sure Kentucky's ready for that future and is part of that future, whether it's solar, wind, hydro, geothermal, whatever.
Thank you,
Mr. Massey. You can answer the question as well.
Thank you. So Kentucky at one time was one of two coal producing states in the country. That was when coal was king. And frankly, coal ran our energy plants. That has changed. The problem with that is, and I'm advocating that we try to help the people that are in the coal world, because that's in Appalachia, Kentucky, where there's a lot of times no other industries. And somehow we've got to help those folks. Now, I'm all for renewable energy. In fact, I'm a consultant for a renewable energy company. And so I'm all for solar, improving the lighting, LED lighting. I work with the school groups. So basically, we try to go to schools and say, you can make your buildings more energy efficient, and this is how we can do it, whether it's through lighting, whether it's through solar, whether it's through changing your control panels, which turn your lights on and off when you're not in use, et cetera. And you'll notice that some buildings now, when you walk into the room, the lights either come on, and if nobody moves in the room for a while, they go off. That's all about saving our energy. So we're trying to do that. And I think coal is done for Kentucky. I don't think it's coming back. In fact, it moved from coal to strip mining, and as strip mining took over, the deep mines in Kentucky faded away. But I think we got to do something to help those communities, to either get industry to those communities, because those students, those kids from those families, still are entitled to the same free and appropriate public education as you are. Now, that being said, Mr. Enriquez has talked about funding. Here's the problem. We've only got so much money. We can't fund what we don't have. And you've heard today that education's a priority. Healthcare is a priority. This is a priority. The only way is for us to find other avenues to raise money. And I will tell you, the challenge has been, I don't think any of us, any of your parents, any of you, want to pay higher taxes. But if you don't pay for roads, you're not going to have them. If you don't pay for renewable energy, you're not going to have it. I'm not advocating tax increases. I'm advocating that we have to all play a part and be part of the solution and not part of the problem. I just don't know where we're going to get the funding to do all of that, especially in a pandemic.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
Thank you both. Mr. Enriquez, Mr. Massey addressed you directly, so we will give you
to respond if you would like.
I'd just like to say that I agree that we need to find additional sources of revenue. And yes, taxes are one source of revenue, individual taxes, but there are other sources of revenue, whether it's expanded use of marijuana and hemp, expanded gaming. Again, some of the tax loopholes earlier with large ticket items. There are a number of ways to generate revenue, and we do have to generate more revenue. What we can't fall into the trap of is, this is all the money we have, and let's not find. We just can't find any more, so that's all the money there is. We just have to get creative and find it.
Just
Thank
real
you.
quickly.
We'll move on to the next question.
The last sessions, in fact, I served on L&O, and I supported that, and it came out of the House, but didn't get into the Senate. So, it's a process, and I just want you to know that I'm looking for those additional resources, including expanded gaming.
Thank you both. We'll move on to the next question.
This question is for Representative Massey. Today I'd like to talk to you about redlining. People inside previous redline neighborhoods are more often denied mortgages, have more run-down schools and worse working conditions. It contributes to systematic racism by de-investing our neighborhoods, resulting in perpetuating cycle of poverty and low property values. This is a particular issue in Louisville, but we see the lasting impacts of redlining in various cities, even though it is no longer an active practice. This leads me to my question. How would you help those areas and try to be able to give everyone a fair chance? How can we try to fix some of the areas, make the environment better without gentrifying some of the people so they can flourish?
I had a hard time understanding, but I'm going to take a stab at it. It was just hard to hear. I think what I heard you say is that we have some real problems, especially in our urban communities and our poor communities, that we need to help address those issues, and what can we really do about that? Is that fair?
Yeah.
Okay. So I agree with that. In fact, one of the suggestions I would have had for the pandemic, I never got the opportunity because, frankly, I even asked through the governor's chief advisor to speak in dialogue, and we've not heard from the governor since March. Very frustrating. But that all being said, I would have said that we should divide it up into urban, suburban, and rural districts, because how we address the pandemic is different in an urban community than it is in a very rural community where you don't have a lot of people. So I think the same is to be said about how we look at our communities. If you're going to have an urban community, more than likely there's going to be more poverty, there's going to be more crime, there's going to be all kinds of issues that come about. And I think that we have to segment those areas and deal with that. We have to deal with Louisville. I mean, Louisville, it's a tragedy what has happened in Louisville, not just with Breonna Taylor, but what has happened in the community. I've drove through Louisville, it's boarded up, and that was a beautiful city, a place where you could go. You had 4th Street Live, the Derby's there, all kinds of things. And that's been set back now for a decade just over what's transpired. We are going to have to fix that. So what I think is going to have to happen is we have to have all of the officials working together. The mayor of Louisville, the council of Louisville, the General Assembly, the governor's office. And we have to come together and understand that we are different and that we have to treat those issues differently. Every person in Kentucky, every Kentuckian is important, everyone. And so we need to take care of them as good as we can. Thank you.
Mr. Enriquez.
Thank you. Excellent question. The urban areas and the suburban areas need to be focused on, and there are definitely differences, just as there are with the rural areas, which also need to be focused on. There needs to be an investment, and I know we're talking money again, but there needs to be an investment not just in money, but in what happens with those areas and the focus of those areas. In urban areas particularly, there seems to be a reluctance to own what's going on and really dig down to the underlying issues. For instance, the lack of good transportation, affordable transportation to get people to jobs that are available. Many times in urban areas, people don't have their own cars, don't have access to reliable transportation, and so they rely on the transportation that there is. And I know I'm not familiar with Louisville's transportation system, but in northern Kentucky, for example, a lot of the jobs are over in Cincinnati and in Hamilton County, and trying to navigate the public transportation in northern Kentucky into southwest Ohio and the other way too can be very, very difficult. So those kinds of things need to be addressed. Those underlying issues need to be addressed before you can really start digging into, okay, let's improve other parts of that infrastructure. People have to have jobs that they can get to, meaningful work, making good wages so that they have an income. Then they can use that and invest in their communities. And then the governments, whether it's the state government or the local government, city, county, then can work with those people that live in the areas and say, okay, let's work together to make this better. Maybe we can, maybe if you agree to pay for half, we can buy a tree, you pay for half the tree, we'll plant it, and you start improving infrastructure. I know a tree is a tree, but it's little things like that that start making a difference, and then you grow to the bigger things.
Thank you.
Gentlemen, I want to thank you both. We'll move on to the next question.
Mr. Henriquez, on your website, you have stated that you would like to incorporate more diversity into our society. However, you don't explicitly state how you will do this. Recently, 2 Supreme Court justices said that they would be willing to revisit the 2015 Obergefell versus Hodges landmark case with the ruling that decided civil marriage is a right for same-sex couples. How will you incorporate diversity now, and how will you promote inclusion if the Supreme Court decides to revisit that case?
Excellent. So first off, if the Supreme Court is going to, whether they're going to revisit the case or not, I think it's important for the state of Kentucky to commit itself to diversity. So I would propose that we introduce similar legislation allowing, in the state of Kentucky, allowing recognizing same-sex marriage along with other forms of marriage. I think it was also important to commit to diversity, whether it's racial diversity, ethnic diversity, or gender diversity, and introducing those laws at the state level are a way to, and passing those laws at the state level are a way to make sure those are implemented here. Obviously, as a state representative, we wouldn't really have influence on what happens at the federal level. But as long as the law does not violate the Constitution, the federal Constitution of the United States, and the Supreme Court doesn't find it as a violation of that, then a state is allowed to enact a law to ensure those rights locally. And so that's how we ensure it here, no matter what happens at that level.
Thank you, Mr. Massey.
I believe that every Kentuckian is important, and I believe in civil rights and equal rights for every Kentuckian. I don't believe in preferential treatment for any particular group. I think we are in the same boat, and we need to be rowing in the same direction. The court is an interesting animal because obviously we're in the middle of an appointment right now. The confirmation hearings are going on as we speak here today. And how that court makeup happens is because they're chosen by the president, depending on which particular party they're affiliated with. I think one of the problems in our society is that we have become so uncivil to one another. It used to be that, and I will talk to anybody. I don't care if you're Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, Green Party, doesn't matter. I'll talk to you. I can learn something from everybody I talk to. Doesn't matter if you're black, white, Hispanic, doesn't matter to me. But that's not the case with a lot of people. And so the problem is there's conversations just aren't happening, and people are mad and angry, and they're getting in these little silos, And when legislation is made out of vengeance against another party or against another person, it is poor legislation. The fact is, we're all in this life together. I often say that 100 years from now, nobody's going to remember who I was or even what my name was. If you think about it, who was your state representative 100 years ago? I'm sure that none of you are going to have, I won't say sure, because somebody will be a history buff that has it, but I doubt that any of you know who was your state representative 100 years ago. So that being said, what's important is that we work together now. We all work together. It doesn't matter if you're straight, gay, if you're black, white, it doesn't matter if you're male, female. We're all in this life together, and we've only got a limited time in this life together. A lot of these battles are fought on religious grounds, and I think we have to give people the right to express their religion, but at the same time, we have to respect others that are different from us. And I think only by working together in civility are we going to bring our neighborhoods to more diversity.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
We'll move on to our final question of the afternoon.
My name is Kendall Foreman, and my question is for Representative Massey. My question concerns the opioid epidemic in our state. During COVID-19, opioid drug overdoses have increased by 18%. Some of the overdoses were people who relapsed amidst circumstances presented by the pandemic. Seeing as progress to combat the opioid epidemic has regressed during our current coronavirus healthcare crisis, what steps do you think could be taken to minimize deaths by overdose during this time? Also, how will you further help people who previously had drug addiction from relapsing?
This is a very difficult area because opioid and heroin abuse in our society has become its own pandemic, if you will. If not, it's epidemic if it's local, but pandemic if it's worldwide. Drug problem really doesn't just live in Northern Kentucky, but we are a core area. I had a client just a few weeks ago that came in to see me, and before we could get to his court hearing, had died from an overdose. I had a friend who's a doctor whose son died from a heroin overdose. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what race you are. It doesn't matter what level of income you are. It affects all. I think we've got to, going back to what we talked about earlier, we've got to have some treatment and care for these people because the addiction, I can't imagine what it would be like to have something so addictive that you couldn't go without it. I just can't imagine that. I haven't had that experience in my own life, but I've witnessed and been around people that do. One of the things we've tended to do in our communities is we incarcerate people. That's not going to make them better. I can tell you when they get out, they still have that addictive personality. Unless they have some mindset training or have some resources, they're not going to get better. So one of the things we're working on judicial reform is how can we help people instead of just lock them up? And I don't know if you knew this, but Kentucky has one of the highest incarceration rates in the nation. We are, and especially among women. And so we are trying to fix that through some judicial reform, making things less difficult, felony expungement, giving the people the ability to go back and get jobs. But it's not just jobs. They've got to have the health care and treatment that they need. And until we deal with this, it's going to continue to percolate in our community. And unfortunately, many people are dying as a result of it.
The opioid epidemic is a real problem here in Northern Kentucky, specifically, and throughout the country in many areas. So it's something that's not definitely unique to us. I think one of the things to understand about addiction, especially drug addiction, is it has a very, very high relapse rate. Folks that go into rehab and complete rehab, don't leave it early, but complete the rehab program, particularly when it comes to heroin and those types of drugs, the opioids, they have a relapse rate of like 80%, which means that they're gonna start using again. So I think it's important that we have programs that understand that and that are geared towards that. And so that means, making sure that there's follow-up for people once they've completed the program and that there's an easy way to get them back into a rehab center when they do relapse. And I know it may sound kind of weird to say when they do relapse instead of if they relapse, but the numbers say that chances are they will relapse. And I think we need to gear ourselves to that. It's similar to some of the areas that are opening field hospitals for COVID-19. Yeah, they don't have people to fill those now, but the expectation is they're going to need them. And rather than waiting till they need them and not having them, it's better to have them so that when they are needed, they're available. The number of beds and facilities is a big issue in Kentucky. Finding additional beds, creating additional beds is important. Again, we talked about the different geography of Kentucky. Lots of times people that live in Appalachia have to drive 2, 3, 4 hours to even get to a facility that has a bed. And if you're in crisis, in a opioid crisis and trying to get help for your addiction, that can be difficult, if not impossible, to even get the help you need. So it's really tied very heavily into our healthcare and access to healthcare, and making sure that we have plans to address all those different geographies in our state and all those different areas, and that the beds are available and ready.
Thank you. Those are all of the questions we have today. Thank you, Representative Massey and Mr. Henriquez, for thoroughly and thoughtfully answering our questions. We appreciate your participation in this debate, as well as your work to better our communities in Kentucky.